In January 2014, a delegation of African-American activists took a trip to the occupied Palestinian territories to get a better sense of what life is like for the people of the area living under brutal Israeli control. That's today on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and thanks for joining us. The Israeli political establishment likes to describe Israel as a land with no people for a people with no land. Now, while that may sound quaint, it has no historical foundation. In fact, the people that were living there when Israel was settled and established in 1948, the Palestinians, are the direct descendants, genetically, of the Israelites, the people that were there thousands of years ago. In fact, while the area may have been part of the Ottoman Empire at one point, then controlled by British, the reality was that there was a distinct population that was there. And they have found themselves with few rights that the Israelis are bound to respect. In January 2014, I had the honor of leading a delegation of African-American activists and cultural performers and artists to Palestine, the occupied territories of Palestine, and Israel. I subsequently wrote a piece called Traveling Through Palestine While Black, and that title sums up a number of things. One was the obvious reality that we're black and we traveled through Palestine. But the other thing that it summarized was the feeling of the racialization of the conflict in Palestine. That the Palestinians, they're subject to intense racial persecution. There was this intense violence that surrounded us, not violence as described in the US media from Palestinian activists, but the violence of the occupation. And it is that we're going to discuss with you in this segment of The Global African. Joining us for this discussion is Reverend Graylan Hagler. Reverend Hagler is the Senior Minister of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ. He was born and raised in Baltimore, and actually we met in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1980s. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be here. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. You and I were on the delegation to occupied Palestine and Israel in January of 2014. And I'm wondering, in view of the violence that's taking place, most recently the murders in the synagogue, did that trip prepare you for that reality? Were these murders of any surprise to you?
Well, the murders really, unfortunately, were not really much of a surprise for me, because the context that we saw in Palestine was one of brutality, oppression, and we use words like that, but we really don't even grasp the gravity of it unless you sort of actually see what we're talking about. It's sort of like the words are kind of mild words in comparison to what goes on day to day, moment to moment. One of the things that's increasingly frustrating for me is, and pretty much being a historian, it continues to be frustrating, we tell the facts or we tell the news without a context. So we're focused on the deaths in the synagogues that happened the other day, as unfortunate and bloody as they were. But interestingly enough, we don't mention October 30th, when the second most sacred shrine in Islam is closed down by the Israeli military.
Al-Aqsa.
Right. People cannot worship there at the Dome of the Rock because the settlers want to be able to expand their worship onto where the mosque sits. Right. So and not to mention even before that, when Sharon, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers, went up into the Dome of the Rock.
You know, it's interesting because when you talk about provocations, I felt like the wall was an ongoing provocation. And what struck me in looking at the wall was the violence contained in the wall, the so-called separation wall. You felt like you were in a prison, permanently, everywhere we went.
Sure. I mean, and that's staring you in the face day after day, day after day, right? I mean, and it's restricting your movement, it's restricting your ability to earn a livelihood, it's restricting your ability to get an education. In fact, it's controlling all the resources, the water, which is rationed out to Palestinians in occupied territories, and all those types of things. I mean, so it's a continued provocation. It's a continued attack. And yet we sort of treat it as if somehow what is going on, particularly in terms of Palestinians, has no connection whatsoever to the constant provocation that has been created by the State of Israel.
Was there any one particular thing that really jumped out at you from the visit, something that you may not have been expecting?
Well, I think that what really jumped out at me was the numbers of people that refer to themselves as Israelis or Zionists that are actually immigrants from elsewhere, from Europe and from the
Chicago.
U.S., Chicago, Rockville, right?
Right.
Canada,
That's right.
And so basically, it really drives home the fact that this so-called State of Israel is actually an incursion by Western interests into that area of the world.
It was one of the things that struck me, in addition to what you're just raising, was the way that the impact that the trip had on our entire delegation. I will never forget how, when we went to Hebron, one of our delegation had to return to the bus. You remember? And she said, "I can't look at this anymore." Right. And there were a number of emotional acts by each of us. I mean, different things that we did that I thought represented almost like the trauma was just surfacing like bile. Did you feel that?
Well, sure. I mean, and let me sort of bring that up since because I think this also fits in with the previous conversation about context.
Yeah.
In Hebron, you had an attack carried out in the mosque.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
By one of Rabbi Kahani's disciples.
That's right.
And Israel's response was what? Was to take half the mosque and turn it into a synagogue.
Right.
Absolute provocation all over again.
That's right.
And then basically the whole area gets surrounded by Jewish settlers, and you have soldiers on top of soldiers at every checkpoint, and you got people throwing garbage down on the old markets there.
Do you think that the apartheid label is appropriate?
I think it's very appropriate. I think it's very appropriate, or Jim Crow, because you're looking at crazy things like the wall. The wall that separates one from their own issues of survival. Then you're talking about roads that are Israeli-only roads that basically connect settlements that are deep in so-called Palestine with Israel, and so you can't be on those roads if you're Palestinian. I think you remember when we were walking down the road in Hebron. And the soldiers came up there running to us.
I do.
And I asked them the question, why? And their response was, because Arabs are not allowed on this road. Right?
Well, that story, we should actually fill out the context, because it's very interesting. And we were walking down a road that had been closed off to Palestinians in the Second Intifada, where there had been a major Palestinian market. And the Israeli checkpoint was there. And one of the people was from Chicago.
That's right.
I'll never forget that.
That's right.
And he was just joking with us initially until we wanted to go by. And that's when they wanted to see our passports.
That's right.
Yeah. It was very threatening. And I mean, it's very threatening. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm not sure that people in the United States really get, that the Israeli occupation is not passive. There's nothing passive about this. It's very threatening all the time. And these young soldiers with these big automatic weapons, you don't know what they're going to do.
Well, I would almost argue with that, because you do know what they're going to do. And they're going to protect Jewish life and Jewish property, and everything else is expendable.
Let me ask you this. Many of us that have spoken out on Palestine have been attacked some physically, but generally verbally, and accused of everything, but particularly anti-Semitism. What happens? I'm sure you've been a victim of such charges. What do you do? How do you respond to that?
They can kiss my grits. But let me put it this way. I recently ran for council, city council in D.C.
Right.
One of the organizations called me up and said they wanted to endorse me. Mm-hmm. And it was an organization, Jews United for Justice. Mm-hmm. And the question was, before they would endorse me, what was my position on Israel? Mm. And I'm responding, this is for city council. You understand it's not for Secretary of State, it's not, right? This is for city council, right? Mm-hmm. They say, yeah, but we need to know your position on Israel. And so basically I said to them, I said, well, you got obviously your sensitivity, so why don't you send me a statement and I'll take a look at it. Mm-hmm. And so they sent me a statement and I sent it on to some Palestinian Christians I knew to look at the statement to see if they would be offended. And so they did some editing and we sent it back. Then I get the call back. They said, well, you don't precisely say in here that you support the right of Israel to exist. And I said, hold it. I said, we're not going down that road. This is about the city council. Obviously, I believe everybody has a right to exist. I said, but I don't believe in a Jewish state. Right. And I don't believe in an Islamic state or a Christian state. Mm-hmm. I don't believe you can't have democracy and talk about being a Jewish state in the same breath, or democracy and talk about being an Islamic state in the same breath. It doesn't work together. You can't talk about being a Christian state and democracy in the same breath. It doesn't work, because that means that if you don't subscribe to any of those, you don't have the same rights as anybody else, and that's not democracy. So how can a Palestinian Christian recognize a Jewish state and be a part of the democratic process? Because once you recognize as a Jewish state and you're not Jewish, then it's clear that you are no longer a major entity in that state. Or as a Muslim, recognizing a Jewish state. So that's a bigger pill to swallow, and really an impossible pill to swallow. And it really, in a sense, that it diminishes our idea of what it means to exist in a pluralistic world.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And so in effect, you end up having not one citizenry. You have citizens, and then you have sub-citizens.
That's right. Indeed. That's Jim Crow all over again,
Jim
right?
Crow. That's right.
Is that you don't have the same resources, you don't have the same access, you don't have the same rights. You can't really vote in the process. I mean, all those types of things get tied up in it.
Let me ask you one more question. Why, and I get hit with this all the time, why should African Americans be concerned about this? And why shouldn't our attention be, if not exclusively on domestic issues, on situations in the African world? Why Palestine?
Well, I always respond to people this way, because we always have this kind of discussion where people say, well, I'm more interested in unemployment in the U.S. I'm more interested in the new Jim Crow. I'm more interested in everybody, but the problem is that those become, majority of the time, excuses not to be involved at all. Because when you look around, there's not a whole lot that's going on around the prison industrial complex. There's not a whole lot that's really, and you go down and all the people that sort of raise those questions. The issue is, as black folks in the U.S., we are a universal people. And when I say a universal people, that's different than African American now. Black folks in the U.S., or black folks in the Caribbean, or black folks wherever we are and define ourselves as black folks, we recognize that we're a unique entity. Entity that is connected to the mother continent, but also an entity that's wrought and created in a larger world context, with flowing through our veins as many different bloods and many different cultures and nationalities. And therefore, in a sense, we are a race that has been created as the guardians of justice in the world. And that's why we need to be concerned about Palestine. That's why we need to be concerned about South Africa. That's why we need to be concerned about what goes on in Baltimore or Southeast Washington or Ferguson, all over. Wherever there's injustice, we need to be concerned. Because one thing that we recognize out of our own history is that when we ignore the injustice, the injustice eventually comes and haunts us. What takes place in terms of Native folks and their displacement of land also comes down to black folks and their displacement of land. It eventually gets around to haunt you. And so that's why we're called to be the guardians.
Reverend Hagler, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back in a moment. Joining us is Dr. Robin Spencer, who's an assistant professor at Lehman College in New York, an assistant professor in history, where she teaches courses on the Black freedom movement. Her areas of research include civil rights and Black power, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. Welcome, Dr. Spencer.
Yes, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. So you were part of a delegation in which I participated that visited Palestine early 2014. And I'm curious, in view of the current round of violence that's emerging in Jerusalem and elsewhere, connect that with the trip and your impressions from the trip.
Okay. Well, I have to say that the trip that we took together with the other members of our delegation was really life-altering. It sort of changed my whole view of the political landscape, and it gave me new areas of the world to connect with, and it gave me a new sense of activism in a sustained way. So when I came back from that trip, I immediately started to seek out just more information sources. So I've been doing a lot of reading, and I went from doing a lot of reading to doing and participating in and initiating activist actions to support the struggles of Palestinians for self-determination. Now, even as I began to engage in those sorts of activities, of course, the news was exploding all around, from the war on Gaza over the summer to the recent spate of violence. And it's been quite interesting as someone who's kind of has a sustained engagement now with the on-the-ground struggles going on in Palestine, the support activities going on in other parts of the world. It's interesting to see sort of things flit in and out of the news cycle.
Now, what about this murder, these murders that took place in a synagogue? Did that come as a surprise to you?
Not so much as a surprise. I mean, I think it is because there are, if you look at the weight of the violence and the victims of violence, they've been overwhelmingly Palestinian. So in that sense, the sort of strike back, I think, was surprising. However, I had also been hearing in the news before then stories of increasing escalation of violence. And I feel like in a lot of ways, the situation in Gaza has kind of upped the ante. It has pushed people to the edge and over the edge. And many people have been organizing nonviolently as a result of that. But it's not a surprise that people would pursue other tactics as well. I mean, I think it's the situation of, it's a warlike situation there. And it's unfortunate that, lives are lost in that process.
Give our viewers and listeners a concrete example of what you saw with the wall in terms of the impact on Palestinians. I think it's very hard for people to appreciate it when they're on this side of the Atlantic.
Well, one of the starkest things to me was that the walls protected roads, which were exclusive to Jewish Israelis. And the wall was connected to a system of security, which involved highly militarized zones and checkpoints where people had to show identification, and Palestinians in particular face all types of scrutiny, degrading conditions, and violence and arrests, arbitrary arrests at those checkpoints. So to me, the wall is itself sort of a very tangible symbol of exactly what is going on, because the wall is not only separating people, it's actually delineating space, it's determining rights, it is embodying the dispossession of the Palestinian people and their separation from their lands.
Why should African Americans in the United States be concerned about Palestine with all of the issues that we face? And I hear this, right? People say, well, with all of our issues, why should we be focusing attention on Palestine? What is your response to that?
I think that the situation in Palestine is a moral imperative. And I think that the Black liberation movement has a long history of not just being focused on the oppressions within the national borders, but understanding that African Americans are enmeshed in a system of exploitation that impacts people of color all around the world. And given the fact that the U.S. government is supporting Israel at the tune of millions of dollars per day, I believe that we have an obligation to raise our voices and to signal that level of protest. Also, the racial realities are very real. Mm-hmm. I think that in many ways, the struggle for Palestinian rights and liberation really mirrors the struggles for people of African descent for those same things all around the world. That's why we have such a long history of many Black leaders going over to the Middle East, to Palestine, and trying to make those connections. So I don't see it as a detour. In a lot of ways, solidarity is a type of self-defense. Mm-hmm. And the types of principled alliances that one can make in the course of the struggle are life-altering. I feel like I've learned so much about just the struggle in the U.S. through understanding what's happening in Palestine. Like, it's made me more aware about colonialism in the U.S., which is something we think of typically as something in the past, right? It's the history of the U.S. We don't think about Puerto Rico or Hawaii, the ongoing reality, the fact that we are existing in the moment of settler colonialism ongoing in the U.S., and how to not participate in that or how to challenge that in my society is an imperative now that I'm trying to challenge that in occupied Palestine, right? So I think it's very, very important. You just can't be concerned with those issues that have a direct impact on your daily life, even though those may seem to be the most imperative. But you'll realize that once you solve that issue, it will lead you to many others. Just like in the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, that we're all waiting in the wake now of the murder of Mike Brown. We're really in the wake of a national anxiety crisis and mobilization and organization efforts to figure out how to respond to the likely acquittal of the police officer involved in that case. We're waiting in that moment, and Ferguson demonstrators are being tear gassed with the same tear gas canisters that are being used. They're being sent over to Palestine, right? So the same things are happening. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to eliminate the realities of national context, individual history, individual and collective histories, and things like that. It's not to draw false equivalences, but I think it's really to invite people to broaden their ideal of what liberation looks like. Because how could I feel free if Palestinians are being stomped under the boot of the Israeli state?
Dr. Robin Spencer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. We'll see you next time.